It's just after midnight on August 5th, 1944. Commander Lawson, Red Ramage, peers through the periscope of USS Parche, somewhere in the waters between Formosa and Luzon. What he sees makes his heart race. Stretched across the horizon is a Japanese convoy. Tankers, cargo ships, maybe a dozen vessels in all, laden with the oil and raw materials that keep Japan's war machine running. They're protected by at least 4 escort vessels, their decks bristling with depth charges. Most submarine commanders would shadow the convoy, radio for support, wait for backup. Ramage doesn't wait. Over the next 48 minutes, USS Parche will conduct one of the most audacious surface attacks in submarine warfare history, charging directly into the convoy at flank speed, weaving between cargo ships, torpedoes flying in every direction. By dawn, 5 Japanese ships will be at the bottom of the ocean, and Ramage will earn the Medal of Honor. But here's what makes this moment truly significant. This isn't some desperate gamble by an outnumbered force. This is American submarine warfare, in 1944 operating at peak efficiency. Well-trained crews, working torpedoes, excellent intelligence, and most importantly, a clear strategic mission. Ramage's rampage is just one tiny piece of the most successful submarine campaign in naval history. One that would bring the Japanese Empire to its knees more effectively than any other single aspect of the Pacific War. If you're familiar with World War II, you probably know about the Battle of the Atlantic, Germany's attempt to suffocate Britain with U-boat submarines attacking merchant shipping. It's one of the most famous naval campaigns in history, featuring prominently in films, books, and documentaries. But on the other side of the world, the United States Navy was waging its own campaign against Japanese shipping that would prove to be utterly devastating. It's a campaign that most people have never heard of, despite being arguably more decisive than Midway, more important than Iwo Jima, and more effective than the strategic bombing campaign. This is the story of how American submarines strangled Japan's war economy and won the Pacific War beneath the waves. Part 1. The Road to Unrestricted Warfare, 1930 to 1942. The Paradox of American Submarine Doctrine. In the years leading up to 1941, if you had asked US Navy planners about their submarine strategy, attacking civilian merchant shipping would have been far from their minds. In fact, the United States had actively tried to ban submarines altogether. At the 1930 London Naval Conference, the US joined with Britain in calling for submarines to be prohibited under international law. The proposal failed, but American disdain for using submarines against civilian shipping was genuine and deeply rooted. This attitude wasn't mere hypocrisy or naivety. It stemmed from genuine horror at German U-boat tactics in World War I, where unrestricted submarine warfare had sent thousands of civilians to watery graves and helped drag America into that conflict. The international consensus, codified in various naval treaties, was that submarines should follow cruiser rules: surface, stop, search, and allow crews to abandon ship before sinking a vessel. In practice, this made submarines nearly useless against merchant shipping, since it exposed them to counterattack and allowed targets to radio for help. So, what were American submarines for? As war with Japan became increasingly likely throughout the 1930s, the US Navy dramatically increased submarine construction. Between 1933 and 1941, the Navy commissioned over 50 new boats. But these weren't designed as commerce raiders. They were fleet submarines. Massive boats more than twice the size of their German counterparts, displacing over 1,500 tons, surfaced and stretching more than 300 feet long. The Gato class, which would become the workhorse of the Pacific campaign, exemplified this design philosophy. These submarines could travel over 11,000 nautical miles without refueling, carry 24 torpedoes, and operate at ranges that German U-boats could only dream of. They were designed to accompany the battleship fleet across the vast Pacific, scout ahead for enemy warships, and engage Japanese naval forces in support of the decisive surface battle that everyone expected would determine the war's outcome. The US and British strategy for dealing with Japanese merchant shipping involved surface forces, not submarines. The plan was to use cruisers and destroyers operating from forward bases at Hong Kong, Singapore, and Manila to blockade Japan and interdict its shipping. It was a reasonable strategy, or at least it would have been if those forward bases hadn't been overrun in the first months of the war. December 7th changes everything. At 1:30 p.m. on December 7th, 1941, just 4 hours after Japanese aircraft devastated Pearl Harbor, Admiral Harold Stark, Chief of Naval Operations, sent a message that would define the Pacific Submarine War. Execute unrestricted air and submarine warfare against Japan. The decision was made quickly, without extensive debate or soul-searching. Japan had struck without warning. The forward bases that were supposed to anchor the blockade strategy were falling one by one. The battleship force that submarines were supposed to support was sitting at the bottom of Pearl Harbor. Moral qualms about attacking civilian shipping evaporated in the smoke rising from Arizona and Oklahoma. If Germany could wage unrestricted submarine warfare, so could America. But there was a critical difference that would determine the course of the entire war. Japan was catastrophically vulnerable to a submarine campaign in ways that Britain never was. Japan's Achilles heel. In 1941, Japan's war economy was a house of cards entirely dependent on merchant shipping. The home islands possessed virtually no natural resources. No oil, no rubber, limited iron ore, minimal bauxite for aluminum. Almost no coal beyond what was mined domestically. Everything the war machine needed had to be imported by ship. Before December 1941, Japan's merchant fleet was already stretched thin, carrying troops and supplies to support the ongoing war in China. The Imperial Army had been bogged down there since 1937, requiring constant resupply across the East China Sea. But the China operations were just the beginning. Japan's grand strategy, the one that made war with America seem like a viable option, depended on rapidly conquering Southeast Asia and the Dutch East Indies. These territories contained everything Japan needed: oil fields in Borneo and Sumatra, rubber plantations in Malaya, iron ore in the Philippines, bauxite, tin, and more. The plan was to create a self-sufficient, Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere that could withstand a long war. And initially, the plan worked brilliantly. Between December 1941 and May 1942, Japanese forces conquered an area roughly the size of the continental United States. They captured the oil fields. They seized the rubber plantations. They controlled the mines. On paper, Japan now had access to all the raw materials it could ever need. But there was a fatal flaw. These raw materials were useless sitting in Borneo or Malaya. The oil had to be refined, and Japan's refineries were in the home islands. The rubber had to be manufactured into tires and seals. The iron had to be smelted into steel in Japanese foundries. The bauxite had to be processed into aluminum in Japanese plants. Everything had to be shipped north to Japan, manufactured into weapons and equipment, then shipped south again to feed the military forces defending this vast empire. And almost all of it had to flow through a single corridor: the waters between China and the Philippines, then north through the East China Sea past Formosa to Japan. It was a bottleneck, thousands of miles long, and it was about to become a killing ground. The disastrous first year. But in 1942, that killing ground was more of a minor inconvenience to Japan. The American submarine force, despite having the mission and the boats to conduct commerce warfare, was woefully unprepared to execute it effectively. The problems started at the top. The submarine force in the Pacific was divided into two commands: Southwest Pacific Submarines based in Australia, under Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood, and Pacific Fleet Submarines based at Pearl Harbor under Rear Admiral Thomas Withers, later replaced by Rear Admiral Robert English. This divided command structure would persist through 1942 and contribute to strategic incoherence. Both commands received a bewildering array of tasks that had little to do with sinking merchant ships. Submarines were dispatched to lay minefields near Japanese harbors, dangerous missions that tied up boats for weeks. They conducted reconnaissance of enemy-held islands, gathering beach intelligence for future amphibious assaults. They delivered supplies to besieged garrisons like Corregidor and guerrilla forces in the Philippines. They collected weather data. They evacuated key personnel. Some boats spent entire patrols serving as lifeguards for downed pilots. When submarines weren't performing these auxiliary missions, they were often directed to hunt Japanese warships rather than merchant vessels. This made emotional sense. Everyone wanted revenge for Pearl Harbor, and sinking an aircraft carrier seemed more glorious than sinking a freighter. But it was strategically misguided. Warships were fast, maneuverable, and well defended. A submerged submarine could barely keep up with a destroyer at flank speed, let alone a cruiser or carrier. Of 23 contacts with Japanese capital ships in 1942, only 4 resulted in damage and not a single one was sunk. Ironically, Japanese submarines did far better at this mission. Operating under a doctrine that emphasized attacks on enemy warships rather than merchant vessels, they managed to sink the carriers Yorktown and Wasp and heavily damage both the battleship North Carolina and the carrier Saratoga. It was an object lesson in the effectiveness of submarine warfare against naval targets, but also in how rare such successes were compared to the steady attrition of merchant shipping. When American submarines did conduct commerce raiding, the results were disappointing. At the time, the submarine force claimed to have sunk 274 merchant ships in 1942. These numbers were reported to the press, boosting public morale and making it seem like the submarine force was performing admirably. But submarine commanders consistently overestimated their success. In the chaos of battle, one ship could be mistaken for 2. A heavily damaged vessel that limped home was reported as sunk. Size estimates were inflated. A 3,000-ton freighter became a 10,000-ton transport in the patrol report. A post-war assessment by the Joint Army-Navy Assessment Committee in 1947, using Japanese records, revealed the truth. American submarines had actually sunk 154 merchant ships in 1942, along with 17 warships. Aircraft, mines, and other causes accounted for another 87 merchant vessels. It was respectable, but nowhere near decisive. For comparison, German U-boats in just the first 6 months of 1942 had sunk 526 Allied ships in the Atlantic, and that was without breaking Britain's supply lines. The torpedo scandal. But the most serious problem facing American submariners in 1942 wasn't strategic confusion or cautious commanders. It was their primary weapon, the Mark 14 torpedo. The Mark 14 had been developed in the 1920s and early 1930s in an atmosphere of extreme secrecy and budget constraints. The Navy had test-fired exactly 2 live torpedoes with warheads before the war began. 2. The reasoning was that torpedoes were expensive and dummy warheads could test everything that mattered. This logic would prove catastrophically flawed. Almost as soon as the war started, submarine commanders began reporting problems. Torpedoes ran too deep, passing harmlessly beneath targets. They failed to explode on contact. They exploded prematurely. They ran in circles, threatening to sink the submarine that launched them. The USS Sargo's experience in December 1941 exemplified the problem. Shortly before Christmas, Lieutenant Commander Tyrrell Dwight Jacobs fired 8 torpedoes at 4 different targets. 0 hits. Suspecting a problem, Jacobs meticulously stalked another target on December 26th, spending almost an hour calculating the perfect firing solution. He closed to within 1,000 yards, point-blank range where a miss should be impossible. He fired 4 torpedoes with perfect aim. All 4 failed to explode. The Mark 14 actually had 3 separate fatal flaws, though it would take the Navy almost 2 years to acknowledge and fix them all. First, the torpedoes ran approximately 10 feet deeper than their depth setting indicated. This was discovered relatively early when a submarine commander in Australia managed to fire a torpedo into a fishing net and measure its actual depth. The fix was simple. Just set the torpedoes to run shallower. But the problem had wasted hundreds of torpedoes in the first months of the war. Second, the magnetic influence exploder, a device designed to detonate the torpedo as it passed under a ship's keel, breaking the ship's back, was fatally flawed. It was too sensitive to the Earth's magnetic field, which varied depending on location. In some areas, it would detonate the torpedo prematurely. In others, it wouldn't detonate at all. Many commanders simply deactivated the magnetic exploder, relying only on contact detonation, which brought them to the third problem. The contact exploder was also defective. The firing pin mechanism was poorly designed. When a torpedo struck a ship at the perpendicular angle required for optimal effect, the sudden deceleration would jam the firing pin before it could trigger the detonator. The harder the hit, the less likely it was to explode. Only glancing blows at shallow angles would detonate reliably. The Bureau of Ordnance, which had designed the torpedo, was deeply resistant to criticism. Officers who reported problems were told they were missing their targets, that their depth measurements were wrong, that they were being too cautious. Some submarine commanders were even relieved of duty for making excuses when they reported torpedo failures. It wasn't until September 1943, 22 months into the war, that all three problems were finally acknowledged and fixed. Think about that. For nearly 2 years, American submariners were going into combat with weapons that worked perhaps half the time. They were risking their lives, enduring depth charge attacks, stalking targets with incredible skill and courage. And when they finally got into position and fired, their torpedoes failed more often than they succeeded. The price of confusion. The combination of strategic confusion, overly cautious commanders, divided leadership, and defective torpedoes meant that 1942 was a year of missed opportunities. The Japanese merchant fleet, still relatively undefended and unprepared for systematic submarine attack, lost only about 240 ships to all causes. Japanese imports actually increased in 1942 as captured shipping in newly conquered ports came online. Meanwhile, the US submarine force paid a price for its learning period. 7 submarines were lost in 1942, taking over 400 men to the bottom. The submarine service would ultimately suffer the highest casualty rate of any branch of the US military. About 22% of submariners who served would not return. Those men deserved weapons that worked and strategies that made sense. But lessons were being learned, even if slowly. Certain areas were proving far more productive than others. The waters northwest of Luzon, where the main shipping route from Southeast Asia approached the Philippines, saw 54 patrols that accounted for 81 sinkings. More than 40% of the year's total from less than a quarter of the patrols. Some commanders were beginning to see that the path to victory wasn't hunting warships. It was patient, methodical destruction of Japan's merchant fleet. And in December 1942, a change in leadership would begin to turn the campaign around. Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood, who had been commanding the Southwest Pacific submarines from Australia, was transferred to Pearl Harbor to take over the Pacific Fleet submarines. Lockwood was aggressive, innovative, and most importantly, willing to fight the Bureau of Ordnance over the torpedo problems. His assignment would mark the beginning of the submarine force's transformation from an underperforming auxiliary arm into the most lethal commerce raiding force in naval history. Part 2. The Turning Point, 1943. Lockwood takes command. Charles Lockwood was 53 years old when he arrived at Pearl Harbor in February 1943, taking overall command of Pacific submarines after his predecessor, Robert English, was killed in a plane crash. Lockwood understood something that many senior officers didn't. Submarine warfare wasn't about glory or dramatic battles. It was about patient, systematic attrition. It was about sinking tonnage, cutting supply lines, and strangling an economy. Lockwood had commanded submarines in World War I and had spent the interwar years rising through the ranks while maintaining his connection to the submarine service. Unlike some officers who saw submarines as exotic weapons to be deployed for special missions, Lockwood understood that they were tools of economic warfare. He had also witnessed firsthand the chaos of the Southwest Pacific Command, where submarines were pulled in a dozen directions by competing priorities. One of Lockwood's first acts was to refocus the submarine effort. He dramatically increased the percentage of patrols sent to the critical zone northwest of the Philippines, from just 15% in 1942 to 50% in 1943. This was the choke point where Japanese merchant traffic was heaviest and most vulnerable. Every tanker bringing oil from Borneo, every freighter carrying rubber from Malaya, every transport moving troops and supplies south, they all had to pass through these waters. But increased focus on the right target area wasn't enough if the torpedoes didn't work. And in early 1943, they still didn't. The torpedo war continues. Despite nearly 18 months of complaints from the fleet, the Bureau of Ordnance remained in denial about the Mark 14's problems. They had admitted the depth-keeping issue grudgingly. They had acknowledged problems with the magnetic exploder in some areas, though they blamed local magnetic anomalies rather than fundamental design flaws. But they absolutely refused to accept that the contact exploder was defective. Lockwood decided to prove it scientifically. In June 1943, he ordered a series of tests at Pearl Harbor. Torpedoes were fired at cliffs at various angles. The results were damning. Perpendicular hits, the kind that should be most effective, failed to detonate 60% of the time. The impact actually jammed the firing pin mechanism. It was a design flaw so fundamental that it bordered on criminal negligence. Even with photographic evidence and detailed reports, the Bureau of Ordnance fought the findings. It took until September 1943 for a fix to be approved and implemented, a redesigned firing pin mechanism that wouldn't jam on impact. Finally, after 22 months of war, American submarines had torpedoes that actually worked. The difference was immediate and dramatic. Sinking rates increased substantially in the last quarter of 1943. Submarine commanders who had been labeled as overly cautious or incompetent suddenly started racking up kills. It turned out they hadn't been missing. Their torpedoes had been failing, building the system. While the torpedo problems were being resolved, Lockwood was building the infrastructure for a sustained campaign. Submarine tenders, floating support ships that could rearm, refuel, and repair submarines, were positioned at forward bases including Brisbane, Fremantle in Western Australia, and Midway. These bases reduced transit time to patrol areas and allowed submarines to spend more time hunting. The intelligence picture was also improving dramatically. Since 1942, Allied codebreakers at Bletchley Park and in Washington had been reading significant portions of Japanese naval communications through the Ultra program. By 1943, this intelligence was being routinely passed to submarine commanders, though usually disguised as coming from reconnaissance aircraft to protect the secret. Ultra intercepts could reveal when convoys were sailing, what routes they would take, and sometimes even what cargo they carried. This allowed submarines to position themselves along convoy routes rather than conducting random searches across vast ocean areas. It was the difference between hunting and ambushing. The submarine force was also beginning to adopt wolfpack tactics, inspired by German U-boat successes in the Atlantic, but adapted for Pacific conditions. Instead of single submarines operating independently, groups of 3 or 4 boats would coordinate attacks on convoys, overwhelming the escorts and inflicting maximum damage. The first formal wolfpack operation occurred in October 1943, and while results were mixed initially, the tactic would become increasingly effective. The year's results. By the end of 1943, American submarines had sunk 335 Japanese merchant ships, with another 135 destroyed by aircraft, mines, and other causes. Total Japanese merchant tonnage had declined from 5.2 million tons at the end of 1942 to 4.1 million tons, a loss of over 1 million tons that year alone. More importantly, Japanese imports of critical raw materials were falling. Coal, iron, bauxite, and rice imports dropped to 16.4 million tons in 1943. This was still enough to sustain the war economy, but the trend was ominous. New construction wasn't keeping pace with losses, the merchant marine was shrinking, and Japan was finally waking up to the danger. Japan's belated response. It's one of the great mysteries of World War II. Why did Japan, an island empire utterly dependent on shipping, enter the war with virtually no plan to protect its merchant fleet? The answer lies in Japanese naval doctrine, which had evolved around the concept of kantai kessen, the decisive battle. Japanese naval strategy for decades had centered on the idea of a climactic confrontation between battleship fleets that would determine the war's outcome in a single day, like Tsushima in the Russo-Japanese War. Everything was subordinated to this vision: ship design, training, tactics, resource allocation. Protecting merchant shipping didn't fit into this paradigm. It was defensive, unglamorous, and worst of all, it assumed a long war of attrition rather than a quick, decisive victory. So, Japan entered World War II with only a handful of escort vessels, no developed convoy system, and no doctrine for anti-submarine warfare. By late 1943, reality could no longer be ignored. Merchant ship losses were mounting, import figures were declining, and increasingly frantic reports from the southern resource area warned that raw materials were piling up in ports because ships to transport them kept getting sunk. In November 1943, the Imperial Japanese Navy finally established the Grand Escort Command under Admiral Koshiro Oikawa. It was Japan's first dedicated organization for protecting merchant shipping, created almost 2 years into the war. But Admiral Oikawa's command was crippled from the start. Of the 69 destroyers Japan possessed in December 1941, 38 had been sunk by the end of 1943, most of them in surface actions or air attacks. Not convoy defense, because that's where Japan's naval doctrine had deployed them. The destroyers that remained were considered too valuable to waste on merchant protection when they might be needed for the decisive battle that Japanese doctrine still insisted would come. Oikawa had to make do with converted destroyers, obsolete vessels, and newly constructed escort ships. Japan launched a crash program to build small escort vessels, the Mikura and Yukuru classes, but most wouldn't be completed until late 1944, by which time it would be far too late. The Japanese also ramped up merchant shipbuilding. Between April 1943 and April 1944, Japanese shipyards would complete over 1 million tons of new merchant vessels. It sounds impressive, but it was barely half of what was being sunk. And many of these ships were substandard, built quickly with inferior materials and lacking the speed or defensive armament to have any chance against submarines or aircraft. The convoy system that was finally implemented in 1943 was also inadequate. Convoys were often poorly organized, with insufficient escorts and predictable routes. Japanese anti-submarine warfare equipment was inferior to Allied systems. Their depth charges were less effective, their sonar was inferior, and they lacked radar entirely for most of the war. When escorts did attack submarines, they often did so half-heartedly, breaking off pursuit to stay with the convoy rather than prosecuting attacks to destruction. In short, everything Japan did to protect its merchant fleet was too little, too late, and insufficiently resourced. The Grand Escort Command was trying to plug a dam that was already breaking, and in 1944, the flood would come. Part 3. The Silent Strangulation, 1944 to 1945. The Perfect Storm. By January 1944, American submarine operations in the Pacific had reached a peak of efficiency that the German U-boat force never achieved even in its best days. Every element had come together. The torpedoes finally worked. The depth-keeping problem was solved. The magnetic exploder had been disabled or fixed. The contact exploder had been redesigned. Submarine commanders could now fire with confidence that their weapons would actually detonate. The command structure had been rationalized. Lockwood had overall authority for Pacific submarines, ending the divided command that had hampered 1942 operations. Strategy was clear and focused. Sink merchant tonnage in the critical shipping lanes, particularly between the Philippines and Japan. Intelligence was superb. Ultra-decrypts provided detailed information on convoy movements, allowing submarines to position themselves for interception. The Japanese never realized their codes were compromised, continuing to radio detailed convoy plans that were being read in Pearl Harbor within hours. Tactics had evolved. Wolfpack operations were becoming standard, with multiple submarines coordinating attacks. Aggressive commanders had been promoted, while overly cautious ones had been reassigned. The submarine force had developed an ethos of bold surface attacks when conditions allowed, rather than timid long-range shots. Technology had advanced. Most submarines now carried SJ surface search radar, which could detect targets at night or in poor visibility far beyond visual range. This gave American boats a massive advantage over Japanese escorts, which lacked radar entirely for most of the war. And critically, forward bases were being established closer to the main hunting grounds. The Marianas, a dagger at Japan's throat. The capture of Saipan and Guam in the Mariana Islands in July 1944 was one of the war's pivotal moments, though usually discussed in terms of strategic bombing. The Marianas brought Japan's home islands within range of B-29 bombers, leading to the eventual firebombing campaign. But for the submarine campaign, the Marianas were even more significant. They sat astride Japan's main supply route from Southeast Asia. A submarine operating from Guam could reach the critical waters between Formosa and Luzon in just a few days, compared to over a week from Pearl Harbor. More time on patrol meant more opportunities to attack. Faster turnaround meant more patrols per boat per year. The Marianas also provided bases for long-range patrol aircraft, which could spot convoys and guide submarines to them. The intelligence network became even more effective, with aerial reconnaissance complementing ULTRA intercepts. The slaughter begins. The numbers for 1944 tell a story of industrial-scale destruction. American submarines alone sank 548 merchant ships, more than the previous 2 years combined. But submarines were no longer working alone. Aircraft carriers freed from defensive duties as the Japanese carrier fleet was progressively destroyed, ranged across the Western Pacific, launching strikes against shipping. Land-based aircraft from newly captured islands added to the toll. Mines dropped by aircraft in harbor approaches and shipping channels sank ships that never even made it to sea. Altogether, 980 Japanese merchant ships were destroyed in 1944, over 432 from causes other than submarines. It was a feeding frenzy. Japanese convoys, often poorly escorted and following predictable routes, were massacred. Individual submarines would sink 3, 4, 5 ships in a single patrol. The Americans were racking up tonnage faster than Japan could possibly replace it. Certain patrols became legendary. USS Flasher sank over 100,000 tons of shipping in 1944 alone, a record that would never be broken. USS Tang, under Commander Richard O'Kane, sank 24 ships before being lost to a circular run from one of her own torpedoes. USS Harder, under Commander Sam Dealey, specialized in hunting destroyer escorts, sinking 5 in one patrol and terrifying Japanese anti-submarine forces. And then there was Commander Lawson Ramage and USS Parche. Ramage's Rampage, a case study. On the night of July 31st, 1944, USS Parche was patrolling as part of a wolf pack called Park's Pirates in the Luzon Strait. Ultra-intelligence had indicated a large convoy would be passing through the area, and 3 American submarines, Parche, Steelhead, and Hammerhead, were positioned to intercept. Around midnight on August 5th, Ramage spotted the convoy on radar, roughly a dozen ships with multiple escorts. The other submarines in the wolf pack had lost contact or been unable to reach attack positions. Ramage was alone, and he had to make a decision. Standard doctrine called for a submerged approach, calculating a firing solution from periscope depth, launching torpedoes from long range, then diving deep to evade counterattack. It was safe, methodical, and usually resulted in 1, maybe 2 ships sunk before escorts forced the submarine to break off. Ramage decided to do something insane. He would attack on the surface, at night at high speed, charging directly into the convoy. What followed was 48 minutes of chaos. Parche roared into the formation at 19 knots. faster than most of the merchant ships and nearly as fast as the escorts. Ramage's strategy was to get so close and create so much confusion that the escorts wouldn't dare fire for fear of hitting their own ships. It worked. Parche wove between cargo ships, firing torpedoes at point-blank range, sometimes less than 1,000 yards. Ships exploded and burned, lighting up the night. Japanese escorts fired wildly, hitting their own vessels. One tanker, loaded with fuel oil, erupted in a massive fireball that could be seen for miles. Ramage maneuvered Parche with the skill of a destroyer skipper, dodging between ships, using them as cover, firing constantly. The submarine's deck guns opened up, raking nearby vessels with cannon fire. It was less like submarine warfare and more like a surface battle from the age of sail. By the time Parche finally broke off and dove, 5 ships had been sunk or left burning and dead in the water. The submarine had suffered only minor damage from a single shell hit. Ramage would be awarded the Medal of Honor, one of only 7 submariners to receive the decoration in World War II. But here's what matters. Ramage's attack wasn't exceptional because it was unique. It was exceptional because it was the perfect execution of what had become standard American submarine doctrine by 1944. Aggressive surface attacks, exploiting superior radar, accepting risk to maximize destruction. A dozen other submarine commanders conducted similar attacks that year. The tactics that would have been considered reckless, bordering on suicidal in 1942, were now the norm. The Philippine Campaign and the severing of the lifeline. In October 1944, American forces returned to the Philippines with the invasion of Leyte. The campaign would last until August 1945, but its impact on Japanese shipping was immediate and catastrophic. With American forces based in the Philippines, the main supply route from Southeast Asia was effectively severed. The waters northwest of Luzon, which had been a killing ground for submarines since 1943, now became virtually impassable. Submarines patrolled at will, often operating on the surface in broad daylight, because Japanese air and naval forces in the area had been so depleted. The impact on oil imports was particularly devastating. Japan's refineries required approximately 3 million barrels of oil per month to maintain operations. In 1943, they had received about 2.5 million barrels per month. Not enough, but workable with stockpiles. In the first half of 1944, imports dropped to 1.5 million barrels per month. After the Philippine campaign began, oil imports virtually stopped. In November and December 1944, less than 200,000 barrels reached Japan, a 90% collapse in just a few months. By early 1945, effectively no oil was getting through. 0. Economic collapse. The numbers are staggering. Japanese merchant tonnage declined from 4.1 million tons at the start of 1944 to just 2 million tons by year's end, a loss of more than half the fleet in a single year. Imports of raw materials collapsed from 16.4 million tons in 1943 to just 10 million tons in 1944. But these raw statistics don't capture the cascading effects on Japan's war economy. Steel production, which had peaked at about 7 million tons per year, fell to under 2 million tons in 1945 as iron ore imports ceased. Aluminum production collapsed even more dramatically as bauxite supplies disappeared. Aircraft production, which depended on both steel and aluminum, began to fall despite efforts to maintain output. The oil shortage was perhaps most critical. Japan's military had built up substantial stockpiles in 1942 and 1943. But by 1944, these were running dry just as imports stopped. By early 1945, the military's aviation fuel stockpile had dropped to critical levels, enough for perhaps a few months of operations at best. The Japanese government began desperate measures. They attempted to extract oil from pine tree roots, yielding tiny quantities of low-quality fuel that was barely usable. They tried to develop synthetic fuel production, but lacked the coal feedstock needed for large-scale operations. They rationed fuel so severely that training for new pilots was reduced to a handful of hours. which meant those pilots were massacred when they met experienced American aviators in combat. The Marianas Turkey Shoot of June 1944, where American pilots shot down nearly 400 Japanese aircraft in a single day, wasn't just a tactical victory. It was the result of systematic economic strangulation. Japanese pilots weren't incompetent. They were undertrained because fuel shortages had gutted the training pipeline. The fuel shortage existed because tankers kept getting sunk by submarines. Food supplies also became critical. Japan had never been self-sufficient in food and depended on rice imports from Korea, Formosa, and Southeast Asia. As shipping declined, these imports fell dramatically. By 1945, the Japanese civilian population was on starvation rations, weakening the workforce and reducing industrial output. The strategic bombing question. There's been substantial historical debate about the effectiveness of the strategic bombing campaign against Japan. The B-29 raids on Japanese cities, culminating in the firebombing of Tokyo in March 1945, killed hundreds of thousands of civilians and destroyed vast areas of Japan's cities. But historian Phillips Payson O'Brien makes a compelling argument. By the time the strategic bombing campaign reached full intensity in 1945, Japanese production was already in a state of terminal collapse. The submarine and air campaign against shipping had already strangled the economy. Raw materials weren't reaching factories. Finished goods couldn't be distributed. The bombing campaign was hitting an economy that was already dying. The evidence supports this. Aircraft production peaked in mid-1944 and then began falling even before the major bombing raids. Steel and aluminum output was collapsing in late 1944 due to lack of raw materials, not bombing damage. Fuel shortages were crippling military operations months before cities started burning. This isn't to minimize the horror of the bombing campaign or dismiss its psychological impact, but from a purely economic standpoint, the submarine campaign had already delivered a mortal blow to Japan's ability to wage war. 1945, kicking a corpse. By 1945, the American submarine campaign had achieved something unprecedented in naval warfare. It had actually run out of targets. Japanese merchant shipping was largely bottled up in ports, not daring to venture out. The few convoys that did sail were so heavily protected relative to their cargo value that submarines often didn't bother attacking. The submarine force sank only 160 merchant ships in 1945. The lowest total since 1942. But this wasn't failure. It was success so complete that there was nothing left to sink. What remained of Japan's merchant fleet, about 1.5 million tons, was being destroyed in port by aircraft and mines dropped outside harbor entrances. Ships that had survived submarines and air attacks were trapped, unable to move, slowly rusting at anchor while Japan starved. The mining campaign deserves particular mention. Starting in March 1945, B-29 bombers began Operation Starvation, dropping thousands of mines in Japanese harbors, the inland sea, and coastal shipping lanes. These weren't ordinary mines, they were acoustic and magnetic mines that couldn't be swept by conventional methods. They were so effective that they virtually paralyzed what little coastal shipping remained. By August 1945, Japan's economy was effectively dead. Factories stood idle for lack of raw materials. Cities were starving for lack of food imports. The military was grounded for lack of fuel. The situation was so desperate that when the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, some historians argue they merely provided political cover for a surrender that was already inevitable from economic collapse. Part 4. The human cost and legacy. The price of victory. The American submarine service paid dearly for its success. Of 288 submarines that conducted war patrols, 52 were lost, an 18% loss rate. But because submarines had larger crews than surface ships relative to their size, the human cost was disproportionate. 374 officers and 3,131 enlisted men were killed, about 22% of the 16,000 men who served in submarines during the war. This was the highest casualty rate of any branch of the American military. Some submarines simply disappeared, their fates unknown until decades later when wrecks were discovered. USS Wahoo, commanded by the legendary Dudley "Mush" Morton, was depth-charged to destruction in La Perouse Strait in October 1943 while trying to return from patrol. All 80 men aboard died. The wreck wasn't found until 2006. USS Tang, one of the most successful submarines of the war, was sunk by her own torpedo in October 1944. A circular run brought the torpedo back to strike Tang, breaking her back and sending her to the bottom. Of 87 men aboard, only 9 survived, enduring brutal treatment as prisoners of war. Commander Richard O'Kane, her skipper, survived the sinking, only to spend the rest of the war in a Japanese POW camp. USS Scorpion was lost with all hands in the East China Sea in January 1944, cause unknown. USS Golet disappeared in June 1944 near the Kuril Islands. USS Escalor vanished in October 1944. The list goes on, submarines that simply failed to return from patrol, their crews entombed in steel coffins on the ocean floor. Life aboard a submarine, even during successful patrols, was grueling. Boats were cramped, hot and humid. The air was heavy with diesel fumes, unwashed bodies, and the smell of rotting food. Fresh food ran out within days, and crews subsisted on canned goods and dehydrated meals. Fresh water was severely rationed. Showers were rare luxuries. Men slept in shifts, often sharing bunks, hot racking. The psychological stress of depth charge attacks, where men could do nothing but sit silently and hope the charges didn't crack the hull, was immense. And yet morale remained remarkably high. Submarine crews were all volunteers, carefully selected and extensively trained. They knew the risks, but also knew they were conducting the most effective campaign of the Pacific War. The camaraderie aboard submarines was legendary. Officers and enlisted men lived in close proximity, working together with a level of cooperation unusual in the strictly hierarchical Navy. The Japanese perspective. The toll on Japanese merchant mariners was even worse, though less well documented. Approximately 116,000 Japanese merchant seamen served during the war. Of these, about 60,000 died, a staggering 52% casualty rate. These weren't military personnel. They were civilians, many of them conscripted to crew merchant vessels that were increasingly sent on suicide missions through submarine-infested waters. The experience of being torpedoed was terrifying. Most merchant ships lacked adequate lifeboats or safety equipment. When a ship was hit, especially a tanker carrying oil or aviation fuel, it could explode in a massive fireball, killing everyone aboard instantly. Ships that sank more slowly often went down so fast that crews couldn't launch lifeboats. Men found themselves in the water, often hundreds of miles from land, with no rescue coming. Japanese policy regarding merchant marine casualties was callous. Unlike military personnel, merchant seamen received little recognition or compensation. Families of dead seamen often received minimal support. And because so many ships simply disappeared without survivors, countless families never learned what happened to their loved ones. The Japanese merchant marine was also multi-ethnic, including many Koreans and Taiwanese who had been conscripted or coerced into service. These men faced discrimination even as they risked their lives, and their deaths are often forgotten in discussions of the war's toll. Why did the American campaign succeed where Germany failed? It's worth examining why the American submarine campaign against Japan was so much more successful than Germany's campaign against Britain. Both targeted island nations dependent on maritime imports. Both employed technologically advanced submarines. Both benefited from codes being broken. So, why did America succeed in strangling Japan while Germany failed to starve Britain? First, geography. Britain could receive supplies from multiple directions. From America across the Atlantic, from Canada through the Mediterranean when open, and via convoy routes around Africa. Japan had a single main supply line from Southeast Asia, creating a choke point that could be systematically targeted. Every tanker from Borneo, every freighter from Singapore had to pass through the same relatively narrow waters between the Philippines and Formosa. Second, industrial capacity. Britain and America vastly outproduced Germany in merchant shipping construction. The American shipbuilding program alone produced over 2,700 Liberty ships during the war, far more than German U-boats could ever have sunk. Britain received these ships via Lend-Lease while building substantial tonnage of its own. Japan, by contrast, never came close to replacing its losses. Japanese shipyards peaked at about 1 million tons per year, while losing 2 to 3 million tons to enemy action. Third, anti-submarine warfare. The Allies developed extremely effective anti-submarine warfare techniques. Radar, sonar, ahead-throwing weapons like Hedgehog, escort carriers, long-range patrol aircraft, and most importantly, tactics refined through hard experience. By 1943, German U-boats were being hunted to extinction by increasingly sophisticated Allied defenses. Japan never developed comparable capabilities. Japanese sonar was inferior, they lacked radar, their depth charges were less effective, and their escort vessels were too few and poorly trained. Fourth, strategic focus. Germany attempted too many missions with its U-boats, attacking warships, conducting reconnaissance, laying mines, transporting supplies to isolated garrisons. By spreading their submarine force across multiple missions, they diluted the commerce raiding effort. America learned from early mistakes and by 1943 had focused its submarines overwhelmingly on merchant shipping in the most productive areas. Lockwood's decision to send 50% of patrols to the Philippine waters was exactly the kind of concentrated focus Germany never achieved. Fifth, code breaking. While both sides benefited from reading enemy codes, the Americans arguably made better use of ULTRA intelligence. German U-boats operating in the Atlantic faced countermeasures informed by decrypted German messages. Allied convoys could be routed around wolf packs whose positions were known. Japanese convoys, by contrast, sailed into ambushes because American submarines knew where they would be. The asymmetry worked in America's favor. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, doctrine. Germany's U-boats were designed and employed primarily to blockade Britain, but German strategy never fully committed to this approach. Resources were diverted to capital ship construction and other priorities. Japan's response was even worse. They had no doctrine for protecting merchant shipping.